Miss Marple and the Widow's Broken Clock, Chapter 1. The quiet tick before the storm. It was the kind of morning Marley Combe always wore best. Cool, cloud-stippled, and steeped in the faint scent of lavender and toasted bread drifting from open cottage windows. The village clock tower had just struck 9, a sound that seemed to ripple through the cobbled lanes with a steady, old-world calm. But at No. 6 Church Lane, that calm was about to crack. Mrs. Penelope Charteris, the village's most recently widowed resident, stood in her drawing-room, fussing over a lace doily that refused to lie flat. She had been widowed for 3 months, and though she still wore the regulation black hat, gloves, and all, Penelope had not taken naturally to mourning. She was a woman who liked structure, a tidy house, predictable neighbors, and a breakfast. Boiled eggs served exactly 3 minutes from the moment it hit the water. Which is why, when she glanced up at her late husband's grandfather clock and noticed the hands frozen at 7:17 again, her lips tightened. That wretched clock had stopped working the day Henry died. She had paid twice to have it repaired, and twice it had resumed its slow, almost mocking tick-tick, only to cease again. Always at 7:17, Penelope was about to ring Mr. Featherstone, the local clocksmith, when a knock at the door startled her. It was young Thomas Entwistle, the vicar's assistant, red-faced and breathless. "Mrs. Charteris, terribly sorry to disturb you, but there's something strange down by the orchard gate, behind the cricket pitch." She blinked. "What sort of strange?" There's a man. I think he's dead." For a second, the only sound in the room was the stubborn silence of the broken clock. The orchard gate lay just beyond the rose hedge behind St. Aidan's Church, the place where village boys sneaked cigarettes and old Mr. Warwick walked his spaniel each morning. This was the spot Thomas had described, and there, sure enough, lay the man. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour. He was all brisk questions and polished boots, flanked by a sergeant who kept tripping over his own notebook. A man on the ground was quickly identified as Edwin Fawcett, a quiet, bookish fellow who had returned to Marleycombe only a year ago after decades abroad. No enemies, no debts. A polite recluse. Heart attack, probably, Craddock said with the certainty of someone who had seen too many sudden deaths to be surprised. No visible wounds, no sign of a struggle. "Except," said Sergeant Litt, chewing his pencil, "there's this." He pointed to a smear of dark liquid on the cuff of Edwin's jacket. "Wine? Ink? Blood?" The inspector frowned. And then there was the watch. Miss Marple noticed it before anyone else. She had come at the invitation of the vicar's wife, ostensibly to comfort poor Thomas, who had been visibly shaken. But Miss Marple, though soft-spoken and easily overlooked, never came to such scenes without a purpose. She stood quietly on the periphery, her pale eyes alert beneath her hat. The watch on Edwin Fawcett's wrist was old and cracked. It, too, had stopped. At 7:17. Miss Marple's mouth thinned. A coincidence, perhaps? But she had long ago learned that coincidences, especially in villages like Marleycombe, were often just lies wearing gloves. By afternoon, the gossip had spread like fire across dry hay. In the Marleycombe post office, Mrs. Fenimore whispered to Mr. Beckett that poor Edwin had been jilted in love. At the grocer's, someone claimed he'd seen him arguing last week with a woman in a red scarf. A strange woman, not local. At the garden club, the general consensus was poison, a phrase which caused Mrs. Weatherby to drop her lemon drizzle on the begonias. At Miss Marple's cottage, however, there was no panic, only quiet thought. She sat by the fire, knitting half a tea cozy, while her mind traced circles around the facts. A broken clock, a dead man, a stopped watch, all frozen at the same time. 7:17. And most curious of all, why had Penelope Charteris's clock stopped at exactly the same moment? Miss Marple set her needles down. There had been a murder in Marleycombe. And clocks, she knew, were never just clocks. Chapter 2, Whispers Behind the Lace Curtains. Marleycombe was not the kind of village where murder was supposed to happen. Disagreements, yes. Pettiness, certainly. But not death, not like this. And certainly not to a man like Edwin Fawcett. By the next morning, the entire village had adopted a new rhythm, slightly quicker footsteps, lowered voices, glances exchanged across hedges and teacups. The women at the bakery began slicing loaves, thinner, as though conserving bread might also conserve peace. And at the Golden Lamb, the village pub, patrons whispered into their pints, rather than raising them in song. At the heart of this quiet unease sat Miss Jane Marple, sipping tea in her front parlor, watching the fog lift from the edge of Marleycombe Green. She had received her morning post, which included an uncharacteristically short note from Penelope Charteris. Miss Marple, I feel most unsettled. Might I call upon you this afternoon? There is something about the clock I must speak of. Yours sincerely, P. Charteris. Miss Marple folded the note once and laid it beside her cup. She already knew Penelope would come, and she already suspected what the widow might say, though she'd let her say it in her own careful way. That afternoon, Penelope arrived wearing morning crepe and a face far paler than usual. Her black gloves, though spotless, trembled slightly as she unbuttoned them. Jane, I do hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, dear. Please sit. Would you like a bit of Dundee cake? Penelope declined. She rarely refused cake, which Miss Marple noted silently as another small clue in a growing puzzle. I don't know what to think, Penelope began, eyes darting toward the window. That poor Mr. Fawcett. I barely knew him, of course, but... She hesitated. Well, it's the clock. Mine. I told you before, didn't I, that it stopped the morning Henry died? And again after the repair? Always at 7:17. Miss Marple nodded gently. But when I heard that Mr. Fawcett's watch had stopped at the same time... Jane, I don't believe in spirits or signs. I never have, but this feels deliberate, said Miss Marple quietly. Penelope's lips parted. Yes. Has anyone had access to your home recently? Workmen, perhaps? Penelope shook her head. Only the cleaning girl, Nella, and she wouldn't dare touch that clock. She's frightened of it. And besides, it's in the drawing room right in the open. And no one else? No. Except ... quote, her brow wrinkled. There was a visitor. A man. A week ago. He said he was a friend of Henry's from the war. Odd sort, thick accent German, I think. He asked a great deal about the clock. Come to think of it, I assumed it was nostalgia. But now, Miss Marple gave a faint hum and poured more tea. She knew well enough how memories of war could stretch into the present like shadows at dusk. Sometimes sentimental, sometimes deadly. Elsewhere in the village, Inspector Craddock was doing his rounds. He had already ruled out robbery. Fawcett's wallet had been untouched, and there was no sign of forced entry at his cottage. What troubled him most, however, was not what was found, but what was missing. Edwin's notes. For the past year, Fawcett had spent most days in the back room of the Marleycombe library, scribbling into bound notebooks and typing furiously on a wartime Remington typewriter, without all of it gone. Could be suicide, the sergeant had said. Guilt over something. Old spy? Double life? Don't be daft, Craddock muttered. If he killed himself, why drag himself all the way to the orchard gate? Back at the library, Miss Marple arrived not. Long after the inspector had left, she did not ask for the books Fawcett borrowed. Instead, she asked the librarian shy, mousy Margaret Greenleaf, whether anyone had spoken to Mr. Fawcett the day before his death. Only Mrs. Wickham, I think, Margaret said, fidgeting. She was always trying to get him to join the historical society. Mrs. Wickham, the one who dresses in mauve, lives near the cricket field. Her son died in the war. Miss Marple gave her usual small smile. Ah, yes, poor woman, always searching for meaning in the wrong places. And ... Well, Miss Marple, I don't know if I should say this, but Margaret leaned closer. I heard them arguing. Not loudly, just strangely. She said something about time catching up with him. I thought it was just a turn of phrase, but now... Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Time, clocks, a widow, a dead man with a vanished past. There were threads here, delicate, silken ones, barely visible. But if you followed them carefully, patiently, they would always lead somewhere. She rose, thanked Margaret, and walked out into the brisk afternoon as she passed the village green. The church bell struck 4, and in a cottage window just behind her, another clock stopped ticking. Chapter 3. The man with the vanished past. Long before Edwin Fawcett returned to Marleycombe, he had been something of a ghost, whispered about, seldom seen, and only faintly remembered. He'd left the village as a quiet boy of 17, bound for university and later work abroad. In shipping, some said. In codes, said others, though no one had quite known what that meant. His return had stirred barely a ripple. He moved into the cottage that once belonged to his aunt and began his routine. Solitary walks, long hours in the library, the occasional silent nod to passers-by. People assumed he had come back to retire or to die quietly. In Marleycombe, those two things were often the same. But now Edwin Fawcett was dead, and the village that had ignored him in life was suddenly obsessed with his past. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting untouched. She had been reading through the Devonshire Chronicle, a 1939 edition, for an obituary someone had once mentioned in passing. It had nothing to do with Edwin Fawcett directly, but her instincts told her that the names people forget often sit right beside the ones they remember too well. And there it was, Naval Intelligence Officer, presumed lost, Lieutenant Henry, Charteris among 6 believed dead after mission near Wilhelmshaven. Miss Marple read the article twice. Henry Charteris, Penelope's husband, had been presumed dead during a naval mission in 1940, only to reappear after the war, miraculously alive. A small detail long buried, but perhaps not irrelevant. She rose and reached for her notebook. In her neat, flowing hand, she made a list. Edwin Fawcett, returned 1 year ago. Died near Orchard Gate. Watch stopped at 7:17. Penelope Charteris's clock, same time. Also froze at Henry's death. Visitor, German accent, called on Penelope. Curious about the clock. Missing notebooks from library and cottage. Mrs. Wickham argued with Edwin, said, time is catching up. Something was being covered up. Not just a crime, a history. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was receiving a most unusual visitor. A thin man with a pinched face and narrow spectacles had arrived unannounced at the Marleycombe police station. He carried a leather satchel and a clipped northern accent. My name's Lockley, George Lockley. Internal Records Office, Ministry of Defense. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Defense, you say? What brings you to our quiet little village? I'm here about Edwin Fawcett. We have reason to believe he may have had undisclosed affiliations during and after the war. If there are materials recovered from his residence, notebooks, letters, that sort of thing, we would like to take possession. Craddock's suspicion flared. Why would the mod be interested in a retired shipping clerk? Mr. Lockley gave a strained smile. That's the thing, Inspector. He wasn't a shipping clerk. Edwin Fawcett worked in post-war intelligence. Records suggest he was involved in certain debriefings. Soviet defectors, German scientists, that sort. And now he's dead. Quite. Lockley adjusted his glasses. You may be dealing with more than a village squabble. Craddock leaned back, frowning. Do you believe he was murdered? We believe someone wanted him quiet. That same evening, Miss Marple made her way to Fawcett's cottage under the soft blue dusk. She had always been fond of twilight walks, the hour when secrets seem closest to the surface. With Inspector Craddock distracted by his unexpected visitor, the cottage had been sealed, but not yet searched thoroughly. Miss Marple, never one to trespass, but also never one to let a locked door halt justice, found the kitchen window already ajar. Whether from forgetfulness or foul play, she couldn't yet say. Inside, the cottage was neat, obsessively so. Books arranged by spine color, shoes precisely aligned. The desk, however, had clearly been emptied in haste. Drawers were open, papers gone. The only item left on the blotter was a photograph. Faded. Black and white. It showed 3 young men. In naval uniform, one of them unmistakably Edwin Fawcett. The second she did not recognize. But the third? Miss Marple, Squinted. It was Henry Charteris. Her breath caught ever so slightly, and suddenly she began to see the shape of something forming in the fog, something Edwin may have known, something he never should have brought back with him. Back. In her parlor, Miss Marple lit a small lamp. She added another name to her notebook. Henry Charteris and Edwin Fawcett, same wartime unit. One returned from the dead. The other returned with secrets. And at the very bottom of the page, she wrote a single question. What happened at 717? Because Miss Marple knew, better than anyone, that in a village like Marleycombe, time didn't just pass. It whispered. It remembered. And sometimes it killed. Chapter 4. A visitor from the past. The morning fog lifted slowly over Marleycombe, leaving the hedgerows dripping and the cottages blinking into the gray light. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, drying her hands on a dishcloth, watching the birds fuss over crumbs on the garden wall. She had slept little. Sleep, at her age, was not always restful. It was often when the mind did its sharpest thinking. She had dreamt of clocks, dozens of them, all ticking in rhythm, all stopping at 717, and somewhere among them, a photograph. 3 men. One never came home. One came back too late. One came back with something to hide. That same morning, Penelope Charteris opened her front door to find a man standing just beyond the gate. He wore a dark gray coat and held his hat in both hands, as though unsure whether to present himself or hide. Mrs. Charteris? He asked. Yes, she replied, stepping out carefully, her breath catching. The man was unfamiliar, but something in his expression stirred an uncomfortable flicker in her memory. I'm terribly sorry to call unannounced. My name is Walter Eberhart. I knew your husband. During the war. Penelope froze. Her grip tightened on the edge of the door. From Germany? Yes, I was an interpreter. Henry and I served together. He saved my life more than once. May I speak with you? Penelope's instincts were shouting no, but the strange beating of her heart said yes. She opened. The door wider. Inside, Mr. Eberhart declined tea and sat stiffly in the drawing room, glancing at the tall grandfather clock in the corner. I remember that clock, he said. He used to wind it every Sunday, didn't he? Penelope nodded. You know, he said gently. There was a moment, I think it was in 1944, when we all thought we'd never leave that bunker. Henry said if he made it home, the first thing he'd do is fix that blasted chime. Penelope smiled faintly, her eyes misting. He never did. Walter hesitated. Forgive me, Mrs. Charteris, but I must ask you something rather delicate. Recently, I received a letter from Edwin Fawcett. Penelope blinked. Edwin? I barely knew him. He said he had discovered something. Something about a file that was never meant to exist. And he mentioned your name. He looked up. He said he believed Henry wasn't just a hero. He may have been something else entirely. Penelope stiffened. That's absurd. I don't know. But the day after I received the letter, I read he was dead. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was growing increasingly irritated. I don't like this cloak and dagger business, he said, pacing his office. If Fawcett had ministry secrets, why wait a year to share them? And who the devil is this Lockley fellow, really? Sergeant Litt cleared his throat. Sir, Miss Marple's been asking around. Quietly. She thinks the key might be something to do with Mr. Charteris. Craddock stopped mid-step. Penelope's husband? He's been dead for years. She thinks not everything about him died with him. Craddock sighed. Get me everything we have on Charteris. I want to know what he wasn't telling us. At precisely 4 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at the Charteris home. Penelope greeted her with a ghost of a smile. I had a visitor, she said simply. A man named Walter Eberhardt. I know, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. I saw him leave. Penelope's eyes widened. You knew he was coming? A grainy group photo showed young men in uniform. There were only 5. 2 names beneath were immediately familiar. Lieutenant Henry Charteris Corporal, Edwin Fawcett, but beneath the third figure, in the center, was a name that should not have existed. Private. John Ellery. Miss Marple stared. John Ellery had died in 1943. He was buried in France. His death was part of a tragic, friendly fire incident. She knew that because she remembered the service in Marleycombe. She remembered the grieving mother, the memorial wreath. She remembered it all. So why, then, was his name printed here? In 1945? And why did he look exactly like Henry Charteris? The pieces began clicking into place, not fast. Not neatly, but surely Henry Charteris had died. Or perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps the man who returned to Penelope in 1946 wasn't Henry at all. Perhaps he was someone else wearing the face of a hero, wearing the past like a borrowed coat. And Edwin, on returning years later, had discovered the truth. The man living at No 6 Church Lane, the one who had wound the broken clock and drank his tea in silence, had been hiding a stolen name. Miss Marple stepped away from the archive cabinet and looked down the narrow staircase. It was time to speak with Penelope again, and this time ask the question she had long feared to voice. Did you really know the man you married? Chapter 7. The widow's doubt. The fire in the hearth at No 6 Church Lane had burned low by the time Miss Marple arrived. Penelope Charteris sat near it in her high-backed chair, still in black, though now with a knitted shawl drawn tightly across her shoulders. She looked smaller than usual, not physically, but emotionally, as if part of her had receded into the shadows of her drawing room. Miss Marple was let in by Nella, the maid, and offered tea, which she politely declined. She moved straight to the clock, the tall grandfather with the brass face and stubborn hands. It stood silently, its face now reading 7:17, as it had for days. I believe, Miss Marple said gently, it's time we speak frankly. Penelope looked up, wary. About what? About Henry, or rather, the man you believed to be Henry. A sharp silence filled the space between them. The ticking absence of the clock, the hush of the house, even the wind beyond the curtains, seemed to pause. I don't understand, Penelope said. I saw him. He came home. He had the same voice, the same habits. Miss Marple nodded. But not the same soul? Penelope's lips trembled. She looked away. He changed in the war. That's what I told myself. He smoked more. He walked with a slight limp that hadn't been there before. And And he never spoke of the past. Not once. I thought he was being brave. No, Miss Marple said, softly but clearly. He was hiding something, perhaps even hiding himself. Penelope looked stunned. You're saying he wasn't Henry? I believe he assumed Henry's identity, likely a comrade, possibly one of the other men from their unit. The real Henry Charteris may have died abroad. Your husband was never confirmed in person, only named in a communiqué. But war is chaos. Records blur. Identities shift. Penelope clutched the shawl tighter. There were moments, she whispered, late at night, when he muttered names I didn't recognize. Once, he said, Ellery, in his sleep. I thought it was a dream. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. John Ellery, another soldier, long believed dead. I found his name listed beneath a photo from 1945, but he was supposed to have died in 1943. There is only one explanation that fits. Penelope's hand flew to her mouth. You think the man who returned to me was John Ellery? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and Edwin Fawcett may have discovered the truth. It would explain his sudden urgency, his missing notes, the connection to Alice Conway. But why would John do such a thing? Guilt? Opportunity? Or simply survival? Perhaps he watched Henry die and took his place out of grief, or necessity, or something darker. I suspect Alice Conway knew the truth. Perhaps she uncovered it during her time in the village and fled to protect herself. Edwin found her belongings, perhaps even her journals, and put the final pieces together. Penelope shook her head in disbelief. My whole marriage a lie? Miss Marple reached across and placed her hand gently over Penelope's. Not a lie, she said kindly. A mistaken truth. You loved the man you thought was Henry. That part was real. Penelope stared at the fire. Then ... Why the clock? Because it was his symbol. The one thing Henry, or rather John, tried to control. He likely altered the mechanism deliberately. A way to mark the time of Henry's actual death. 7:17, the moment he ceased to be himself. Or perhaps the moment Henry died. Either way, it meant something to him. Penelope turned her head. And now Edwin is dead. Because he found the truth. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. And someone knew he had? And acted before he could reveal it. Penelope stood slowly and walked toward the clock. She touched its glass face, a single tear sliding down her cheek. I don't know what's worse, she said, that Henry died so long ago, or that I never mourned him properly. Miss Marple stood too. You may now. Penelope turned. Will the police believe you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not yet, but we're getting closer. Clocks may lie, Penelope, but not forever. Chapter 8. The letter that disappeared by the next morning. The story spreading through Marleycombe had shifted again. Edwin Fawcett's death was no longer a tragic accident, nor an unexplained collapse. Whispers grew sharper, closer to the truth. Something had been hidden. Someone had silenced him. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a letter had gone missing. Inspector Craddock, still grumbling about the ministry man who had vanished without so much as a forwarding address, arrived at the library first thing. That morning, Margaret Greenleaf met him with her usual fluttering nerves. Inspector, I didn't sleep, she stammered. Miss Marple was here yesterday. She found some very old records, and I gave her the note Mr. Fawcett left behind. But there's more. Go on, Craddock said. Margaret opened a drawer and handed him a slim envelope. It had no address, only the initials AC. I found it this morning. It had fallen behind the shelf in the reading room. I think it was meant for Alice Conway. Craddock frowned. How long has it been there? I can't say. But look, inside was a single sheet of thick paper. It had clearly been typed on Edwin's old Remington. Craddock read aloud. To Alice, if you're still out there, He isn't who he says he is? Henry Charteris died in 1943. I was there. He drowned during the Bergen extraction. But someone else made it out. Someone with enough nerve and knowledge to steal his name. I kept quiet for years, told myself it wasn't my place. But now, I know what he did after the war, and who he became. You were right. The clocks weren't broken. They were marking the moment it all changed. If I don't make it to London, find Miss Marple in Marleycombe. She'll see through the lies. E. F. Craddock read the letter twice. Then a third time, slower. Well, he muttered. Damn. By midday, Craddock stood once more in Miss Marple's parlor. She served him tea without, milk just how he liked it, and listened without interrupting as he recited the contents of Edwin Fawcett's final letter. When he finished, she simply nodded double quotes. So now you believe me. Craddock sighed. I believe. Something happened. I'm still not ready to say your widow's husband was an imposter, Jane, but it's looking more likely by the hour. If I can get that letter authenticated, It won't matter, Miss Marple said gently, if the person who took Edwin's notebooks gets to the rest of his evidence first. Craddock leaned forward. You think someone else is still in the village? I know they are. And they're afraid, not of the police, of what else Edwin might have left behind. Craddock narrowed his eyes. Are you saying there's more? Miss Marple reached for her knitting bag. From beneath a bundle of half-finished socks, she withdrew a small folded note. I found this in the back cover of the parish newsletter. A tucked-in slip, likely missed by others. It's in Edwin's handwriting. She handed it over. There is one last record. I left it in the place where Henry's lies began. If they find me, it may not matter. But if someone still seeks truth, they'll find it beneath the floorboards. Craddock blinked. Beneath the floorboards? Where? Miss Marple smiled slightly. The old schoolhouse. Before it was converted into flats, Alice Conway used to live in the caretaker's rooms. Edwin knew that. If he returned there, it would be the perfect place to hide something. Craddock stood. Then we'd better get digging. No, but I suspected someone might. News of a death spreads fast, but secrets often spread faster. She followed Penelope into the drawing room and stood before the clock. He asked about Henry, Penelope said quietly. He said Edwin. Thought Henry had done something unforgivable. Miss Marple nodded. May I ask, when your husband returned after the war, did he seem the same? Penelope hesitated. No, he was quieter, angrier, and he had nightmares. Strange ones. He would wake shouting in languages I didn't understand. Miss Marple turned to the clock and touched the brass casing. I believe Edwin found out something that wasn't meant to be known. Something Henry did during the war, something. Buried, and someone knew he'd found it. Penelope's eyes brimmed. Do you think Edwin was murdered? I do, Miss Marple said softly. And I think this clock wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message. A message? To someone, or from someone. The silence between them deepened. So did the shadows. And then the clock, without warning, ticked once. The hands had moved, only slightly. But they had moved. Miss Marple's expression changed. It's been tampered with again, she whispered. And recently. Penelope took a step back. But who? Miss Marple turned. That's what I intend to find out. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Library. The Marleycombe Library was never what one would call busy. But since Edwin Fawcett's death, it had taken on a strange energy like a stage after the curtain falls, when all the actors have vanished, but their presence still lingers. Miss Marple arrived just after 10, dressed in soft gray and pale blue, carrying a cloth handbag that never left her side. She nodded to Margaret Greenleaf, the nervous librarian, and walked quietly toward the back reading room, the place Edwin had all but claimed as his own. The large oak table where he'd worked was still there. So was the high-backed chair he favored. But the shelf beside it, once full of thick volumes on naval strategy, war records, and German-English code manuals, had been hastily rearranged. Some books were gone. Others had been returned to the wrong places. Miss Marple knew, because she had memorized their order weeks ago. Miss Marple? It was Margaret, wringing her hands. I didn't want to speak too loudly yesterday. But there's something odd I never told the inspector. 2 days before Mr. Fawcett died, he asked me to lock away a parcel for him. Said it was confidential, and that someone from London would collect it. A parcel, Margaret nodded. A sealed, brown envelope. He was so precise. Asked me to place it inside the reference cabinet and not tell a soul. But, well, I checked after the police came, and it's gone. The lock wasn't forced. The key was still in my drawer. Who else had access? Only me, and Mr. Avery, the evening volunteer. He's harmless, really mostly nods off, near. The encyclopedias. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but inside, a piece of the puzzle slid into place. Do you know what was in the envelope? Margaret hesitated. No, but ... he gave me a note. Said if anything happened to him, I was to deliver it to a woman named Alice Conway. Alice Conway? Miss Marple frowned. She died 4 years ago. In Devon. Margaret paled. Then what do I do? Miss Marple held out her hand gently. May I see the note? Margaret retrieved it from a drawer beneath the circulation desk. It was thin, cream-colored, and folded precisely in half. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat. The message was short. If I am found dead, do not believe it was an accident. There are names buried in this village that do not belong on any grave. Alice knew the truth. So do I now. E.F. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. She felt the walls closing around her thoughts, the clockwork of this mystery beginning to turn faster. Do you mind if I keep this? Margaret nodded. WODLESSLY. Dr. Craddock was pacing again. He had just received a telegram from London. The ministry man, George Lockley, had credentials, but they were too clean. His name was not in the internal registry under Defense or Intelligence, and he had disappeared. The Marleycombe Inn reported he had checked out early that morning, leaving nothing behind except a short note scribbled on hotel stationery. Some doors should remain closed. If you find the notebooks, burn them. Craddock crumpled the paper, swore under his breath, and marked out for Sergeant Litt. Back at the library, Miss Marple sat alone at Edwin Fawcett's table, staring out the window at the falling leaves. She turned the note over again and again. The name Alice Conway returned to her. A quiet schoolteacher who had moved to Devon after the war. She'd lived in Marleycombe once, in fact, in the same cottage Edwin had moved into. She died of natural causes. But something about her funeral had struck Miss Marple even then. No family, no mourners, no obituary in the village. Paper dot, and now Edwin's cryptic message. Alice knew the truth. What truth? Miss Marple rose suddenly. Margaret, do we still have those bound parish newsletters from the 1940s? Margaret blinked. Oh, yes. Upstairs in the attic archives. Why? Because I believe someone in this village has spent a very long time hiding a name. And we're about to find it. As she climbed the narrow library stairs, dust rising with each careful step, Miss Marple felt her heart beat, not with fear, but with certainty. Secrets, like clocks, cannot tick forever. Eventually, they stop. When they do, the silence says everything. Chapter 6. The name that shouldn't exist, the attic of the Marleycombe Library, smelled of old paper, candle wax, and time, thick and heavy like a church vault. Miss Marple stepped carefully between uneven boards, brushing aside cobwebs as she approached the archive cabinet marked 1940 to 1949. The parish newsletters were bound in cloth volumes, each labeled in a spidery hand. She selected 1946, the year both Edwin Fawcett and Alice Conway had reportedly returned from the war. The newsletter had always printed more than flower shows and cake sale results. Tucked between the lines were real stories, glimpses of village life that, when read closely, often revealed much more than intended. She turned the brittle pages slowly. August 1946. We welcome back Mr. Henry Charters, believed lost during naval operations, now safely returned to Marleycombe. A hero's return to his wife, Penelope. The village bell rang for the occasion. Then September. Miss Alice Conway has resigned from her teaching position. She departs for Devon, following a nervous breakdown. The headmistress extends her sympathies and wishes her well. And October. We note the sudden departure of Mr. Edwin Fawcett, who has taken up employment overseas. Though his reasons were not shared, we wish him safe travels. 3 people, 3 exits and returns, all within 3 months, all with shadowed departures. Then, in the letters to the editor, unsigned, some names should not be spoken. Some men come back with different faces, and some clocks, once broken, should stay broken. Miss Marple paused. The metaphor was too sharp to be literary. Someone had tried to speak, veiled, careful, but desperate. She looked again at the phrasing. Different faces. What had Edwin discovered? At the same time, Inspector Craddock had received a call from Devon Constabulary. We have the death certificate for an Alice Conway, the sergeant on the line reported. Died in 1951. Natural causes, no autopsy. Lived alone. No relatives listed. But here's the odd part. Her personal effects were sent to someone in Marleycombe. Craddock leaned forward. To whom? A pause. Then, to a Mr. Edwin Fawcett. The line crackled. Craddock swore softly. Back in the attic, Miss Marple pulled out another volume, dated 1945. This one was slimmer. Wartime issues were always thin. Ink rationed, type faded. She was halfway through when she found an article on returning veterans. There was never going to be peace for Henry, Miss Marple said. He found something terrible, and for that they replaced him, erased him. Penelope listened with wide, aching eyes. You mean it wasn't just Ellery? They let him die? I believe someone, likely Deansmore, ensured Henry didn't leave Bergen alive, whether through betrayal in the field or subtle sabotage. And Dr. Merton helped conceal it. Not for personal gain, but for Queen and country. Penelope looked down. He died a patriot, but not in the way they'll ever write in history books. No, Miss Marple said. He died because of what? He refused to become. There was silence then, and slowly, Penelope reached over and for the first time in weeks, wound the broken grandfather clock. With a soft whir, the hands shifted. 7:18. Time had moved on. Across the village, Craddock stood outside the abandoned home of Dr. Merton. He held a ministry report, recently declassified. Inside it, one final file. Dr. A. Merton, civilian medical contributor to Operation Nightingale. Compensation arranged. Signed C. Reginald Deansmore. Craddock folded the paper. That's your rope, he said quietly. Let's see how far it stretches. Because now it wasn't just about Marleycombe. It was about what had been allowed to rot beneath the surface, protected by uniforms, ranks, and secrets. And Miss Marple, as always, had seen what no one else dared to. Chapter 16. A visit to the dead man's house. Rain began to fall gently on Marleycombe as Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple stood at the gate of the old Merton cottage. The house, abandoned just 2 weeks earlier, looked no different from the others lining Birch Hollow Lane. Ivy creeping up the eaves, curtains still drawn, and a faint smell of damp earth rising from the hedges. But inside, Craddock knew. Secrets. Lingered. Did he leave in a hurry? Miss Marple asked, adjusting her gloves. Craddock nodded. No forwarding address. Mail still collecting in the box. Almost like he knew someone would come looking. And someone has, she said quietly. The interior of the cottage was strangely preserved. Too tidy, too staged. As though Dr. Merton had wanted to erase every fingerprint of the past. But no house, Miss Marple knew, could truly be cleansed of its owner's conscience. They moved room by room, Craddock opening drawers, checking behind paintings, lifting rugs. Miss Marple's eyes scanned slowly, not for things missing, but for things left behind Dot in the study. They found it, a hidden drawer in the bottom of a bookcase, cleverly fitted behind an old volume of military medicine through the ages. Inside, folder marked Nightingale Retained Notes, several typed pages with chemical dosages and pseudonyms, and one envelope, addressed in elegant handwriting. To whom it may concern, in the event of my disappearance. Craddock opened it. I was never proud of what I did, but I believed we were preserving the nation. That's what Deansmore told me, that Henry Charteris had become a danger, that what he knew could unravel operations and destroy lives. I didn't question it then, but after the war, when the files were locked away and Deansmore disappeared behind promotions, I saw what remained. The lies. I helped a man die, and I helped another take his place. I ensured his tea was dosed, just enough to slow the heart. Natural causes, they said. Dot, when Edwin Fawcett came close to the truth, I panicked. I gave him the same tea, a lower dose. But he had a weak heart. Already, it didn't take much. I am sorry. But I know what you'll say. Not enough. Craddock folded the letter in silence. He confessed. He said finally. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. And yet, she whispered, he still never called it murder. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. Miss Marple stood under the porch awning, watching drops gather on the rose bushes. Craddock joined her. This is enough to close the case. On Edwin. And what of Henry? Craddock sighed. It will be buried in the ministry archives. No one will open an inquiry now. Not after this long. They'll quietly acknowledge it happened and let it fade. Miss Marple nodded. Then, the truth lies here with us. She glanced back at the house. A man killed twice, once in war, once in peace, and both times with just enough deniability to make it feel professional. Craddock looked grim. And both times, the clock knew before anyone else. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple placed a small envelope into her sewing box. Inside was a copy of Merton's letter and Edwin's final note. If the world forgets, she murmured, I won't. Outside, thunder echoed faintly across the hills, and in the Charteris home, the grandfather clock ticked on, no longer. Stuck, but marking the passing of every moment, the truth had finally come to light. Chapter 17. The ghost of Dinsmore. Captain Reginald Deansmore had not been seen in Marleycombe since 1965. He had slipped through the village like a shadow. After Henry Charteris's supposed funeral, offering quiet condolences, shaking a few hands, then vanishing like the fog that clings to a moor just before dawn. But now his name was everywhere, in whispers, in records, in Edwin's final words. And yet, he remained as untouchable as ever. Craddock was the first to break through the fog. With help from a contact in military archives, he tracked Dinsmore to a private residence on the Isle of Wight, living under his real name, with a false pension and a guarded past. I'll need clearance to confront him, Craddock told Miss Marple. I doubt he'll offer the truth, she replied. but he might offer something more valuable, a mistake. They drove out together 2 days later, rain streaking the car windows. Craddock, in his sharp coat and grim expression. Miss Marple, in a pressed gray suit and her quiet eyes, sharper than any warrant. Deansmore's cottage stood at the edge of a cliff, wind-battered and lonely. The sea below crashed in rhythm, as though echoing the years of silence he had bought. Answered the door himself. Older now, bent at the shoulders, but still sharp-eyed. "Detective," he said with the faintest smile. "I wondered when you'd come." "And this is Miss Marple," Craddock added. "She's the reason we're here." Deansmore's smile faded. "I've heard of you." "I do seem to trouble men with secrets," she said sweetly. They sat. In his study, wood-paneled and silent, except for the ticking of a naval chronometer on the mantel. "We've come about Henry Charteris," Craddock said. "Or rather, John Ellery and Edwin Fawcett." "I imagine you have documents," Deansmore said mildly. "We do. Confessions." "Yes? Then I assume you're not here for evidence. You're here for closure." "No, Miss Marple," said calmly. "We're here for truth, which is something different." Densmore's gaze flickered. "There was no Operation Nightingale," he said. "Not officially. Not in a way you'll ever prove. It was a patch, a way to deal. With damaged men, secrets too messy for courtrooms. Henry found something he shouldn't. A name. A leak. You arranged his death," Craddock said. "I redirected a fate already set in motion," Deansmore said coldly. "Henry was a good man, but not a clever one. He believed truth should win over utility. He was wrong." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And Edwin?" Deansmore's voice was quiet. "I didn't order that. I suspected Merton might act ... prematurely. But Edwin made his own enemies. Stirring up history rarely ends well." "Truth isn't dangerous," Miss Marple said. "Only to those who profit from lies." Deansmore stood. "The past is quiet. Now, Miss Marple, let it remain so." "No," she said gently. "The past is loud. It just needed someone willing to listen." As they left, the sea wind howled louder, tearing through the cliffs like a voice rising from the deep dot in the car. Craddock drove in silence for a while, before finally saying, "Do you think it's over?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Men, like Deansmore, always survive the fire. But the people they step on, the forgotten ones, they live on in the details." She opened her notebook and wrote a final line. "Justice is not always punishment. Sometimes it is memory." Chapter 18. A Village in Bloom. Spring had returned to Marleycombe at last. The daffodils nodded from every hedgerow. The air was thick with birdsong, and even the postmaster, gruff Mr. Bletchley, had been seen whistling. The village had changed, subtly but deeply. The truth, once unearthed like a long-buried stone, had sent ripples through every cobbled street and church pew. People spoke more carefully now, but more kindly too. Gossip still fluttered, of course, but it had softened, like bread left too. Rised out at the heart of it all, the Charteris house had come back to life. Penelope Charteris had decided to remain. There were offers, cousins in Dorset, a cottage in Devon, but she chose Marleycombe. She began volunteering at the local school, opened her garden to visitors, and every Wednesday hosted a reading group for women who had spent too long. Being spoken for rather than listened to, she never spoke again of Henry, not in anger nor in sorrow. But she kept the clock dot. It stood now in the hallway, wound and working. At precisely 7:17 each morning, it chimed, a quiet defiance. A memory. A promise. Miss Marple visited often. Not as an investigator, but as a friend. "You've planted roses," she noted one afternoon, sipping tea in Penelope's garden. "3 varieties." Penelope replied, adjusting her sun hat. One for each life I've had, the one I thought I was living, the one I lost, and the one I've chosen. Miss Marple smiled. And the thorns? I keep them, Penelope said. They remind me not to hold on too tightly. At the vicarage, the parish council had resumed its weekly meetings, now chaired, to everyone's surprise, by Margaret Greenleaf. With quiet firmness, she had stepped into Edwin Fawcett's shoes, determined to preserve the records he'd died protecting Dot in the back of the church hall. A framed portrait of Edwin now hung, not the usual posed photo, but one taken candidly, laughing in the library, a teacup in hand. Above it, someone had carved a plaque, in memory of the man who remembered. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, returned to London, the files in his care now sealed and marked for internal reference only. But before leaving, he paid one final visit to Miss Marple. "You're sure you'll be all right here?" "My dear Inspector," she said, handing him a tin of homemade seed cake. "I'm always all right." He shook her hand. "If ever there's another shadow in this village ... I shall know before it arrives," she replied. He smiled, tipped his hat, and then he was gone. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting resting in her lap, fire crackling softly. Outside, the wind stirred the first apple blossoms. Inside, the mantel clock ticked on with gentle certainty. Closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The world was not perfect. The past could not be undone. But in the quiet corners of small villages, justice sometimes bloomed like a forgotten flower, late, perhaps, but no less beautiful. Chapter 19. The final letter. The letter arrived on a bright morning in early May, just as the postman's whistle echoed down Church Lane. Miss Marple, already in her garden sniffing lavender, paused when she saw the handwriting on the envelope. Neat, unfamiliar, but old. She opened it carefully, hands steady despite the sudden weight of intuition pressing at her chest. Inside, a single sheet of stationery, faded at the edges, dated March 1944. It had been sent anonymously, likely delayed or lost for decades. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Henry Charris. I am, at the time of writing, very much alive, though I fear I may not remain so for long. There are things I've discovered that certain men in uniform would rather stay buried. I have compiled a record, stored in the chapel wall at St. Albans in Marleycombe, behind the third panel from the east window. If I am gone, do not trust the man who takes my place. He wears my face, but not my soul. Tell Penelope I loved her, truly, even when I ran." I looked back, and if Miss Jane Marple is still among the living, then I place my faith in her hands. Truth does not die, even when buried. It waits. Henry. Miss Marple sat down slowly on the garden bench, the letter trembling ever so slightly in her lap. Henry Charteris had tried to warn them, not just of the man who stole his life, but of the system that enabled it. By late afternoon, she and Penelope stood in the quiet, sunlit chapel of St. Albans, the stained glass windows painted colors across the pews. Birds sang outside. Miss Marple tapped gently at the third wooden panel beneath the east window. Hollow. With Craddock's permission, the panel was carefully removed. Inside was a small metal box, rusted but intact, and within it a war journal, several photos, a folded map marked Nightingale routes, classified, and a final note. For her eyes only. Miss Marple unfolded it. Miss Marple, they think I am a fool, but I've seen enough of men to know which ones fear truth and which fear weakness. They say I'm unstable, but all I've done is question things. If I die, it will not be in combat. It will be in silence. I hope you are the kind of woman who notices when the clock ticks wrong, because I heard it too. H.C. That night, Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the fire, journal open in her lap, pages thick with names, details. Codes, each entry another knot in the tangled string of what had happened. And why not it had never just been about a single murder. It had been a war wound that never healed. A crime that lasted decades. She looked to her own clock, 7:17. Still, ticking dot as long as it did. So would the truth. Chapter 20. When ghosts tell the truth, the journal left by Henry Charteris was more than a record. It was a confession, a blueprint, a warning. Its pages were filled with observations, names, scraps of intercepted conversations. It read like the diary of a man, unraveling a mystery he was never supposed to notice or survive. And it confirmed everything Miss Marple already suspected. There had never been a random death. Henry hadn't simply disappeared behind enemy lines. He had uncovered a smuggling route, codenamed Nightingale, used by a handful of officers, including Dunsmore, to move art, documents, even people, out of occupied zones under cover. Of night raids, Henry had confronted them. Days later, he was reported dead. Ellery replaced him. Merton forged the certificate. Dainsmore buried the rest under layers of silence and honor. But now, the ghosts were speaking. Miss Marple brought the journal to Craddock's office under a sealed envelope. She said nothing as he read the pages, one after another, his brow tightening with every paragraph. This would cause a scandal, he said finally. No, Miss Marple said calmly. It would cause clarity. But the ministry will bury it, as they buried Henry, she said, rising from her chair. But one doesn't preserve peace by hiding rot beneath the floorboards. Sooner or later, someone falls through. She placed one more document on his desk, a carbon copy of Merton's confession, then Henry's letter, then Edwin's. They deserve the whole truth, she said. Let the dead speak, and let them be believed. That Sunday, the village gathered, not for a funeral, but for a memorial. A new plaque was unveiled beside the war memorial on the green. Captain Henry Charteris, 1916 to 1944, served with honor, silenced with injustice, remembered in truth. Penelope stood beside it, tears in her eyes, but her back straight. She placed a white rose at the base. Miss Marple did not speak during the service. She simply stood behind them all, listening to the silence that followed the final prayer, the kind of silence that meant something had finally been heard. Later, walking back past the garden walls of Marleycombe, she paused beneath the flowering hawthorn by her gate. A breeze stirred her hat. The scent of wet earth and lilac was in the air. Inside her cottage, the clock ticked, calm and steady. 7:17. Still, it held the moment of truth. Still, it reminded her, justice does not always wear robes or carry gavels. Sometimes it wears lace. Gloves, listens more than it speaks, and waits for the exact moment when a small, quiet voice can be heard over the roar of forgotten years. That evening, under a slate-gray sky, Inspector Craddock, Sergeant Litt, and Miss Marple stood in what remained of the old schoolhouse cellar. The room smelled of mildew and dust. Floorboards creaked under their boots. There, Miss Marple sighed, pointing to the far corner, near the base of the chimney. That plank is newer than the rest. Litt pried it loose with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound journal, and within it, names, dates, a timeline of Henry Charteris's final mission, reports from the Bergen extraction, eyewitness notes from Edwin, crossed-out identities, a section titled Operation Crossmask, a wartime operation involving identity swaps for intelligence cover, and one page marked with a red ribbon. John Ellery assumed the name. Henry Charteris on the 17th of June, 1943. Witnessed, filed, ordered sealed. Miss Marple whispered aloud. June 17th, 7:17, 17 minutes past 7. Craddock said nothing for a long while. Then, Well, Jane, I believe we have a murder, and possibly a case of posthumous treason. Miss Marple nodded. And perhaps also a widow who deserves the truth. Chapter 9. A Grave with Thee. Wrong named the churchyard in Marleycombe was quiet, as always, just the faint shuffle of leaves along the path and the occasional hollow caw of a rook. But today it felt different, heavy, somehow, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple walked slowly between the headstones, each one a story, each name carved with care, loss, and sometimes lies. She stopped at a modest granite marker near the eastern wall. It read, Henry Charteris 19171965, beloved husband of Penelope. The flowers at its base were fresh. Penelope had placed them only the day before, clinging to the last shred of the man she believed she had loved. Inspector Craddock joined Miss Marple a moment later, hands in his coat pockets. We checked the records. Official burial certificate, signed by Dr. Merton. Cause of death? Heart failure. Did Dr. Merton see the body? Craddock sighed. No, it was wartime. Many bodies were identified by uniform, dog tags, paperwork. No autopsy, no doubt raised. Miss Marple touched the cold edge of the stone. The grave is real, but the name is not. It's John Ellery down there, not Henry. Craddock nodded. And if we prove it, it may be the first time in this village a man is convicted of murder after his own death. Later that morning, Penelope Charteris sat with Miss Marple once more. Her hands were steadier now, her voice firmer. She wore no black today, only pale blue, soft and simple. So it was John all along? She asked. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and not just wearing Henry's name, living his life, writing letters as him, attending council meetings, loving you. Penelope closed her eyes. He loved me in his own way, I think, but I was never the woman he married, and he was never the man I thought he was. There is a kind of grief in that, Miss Marple said gently, but also, perhaps, a strange kind of peace, knowing at last what was real and what was not. Penelope looked toward the window. And Edwin? He was close to exposing everything. I believe John left behind all eyes, someone who still had a reason to keep the truth buried. Craddock had already begun compiling a list of possible accomplices. Ex-servicemen, wartime clerks, anyone who might have forged the death certificate, sealed files, or helped swap identities. One name, a certain Captain Deansmore, had appeared in both Edwin's journal and ministry archives. He had visited Marleycombe only months before Edwin's death, and now he too was missing. That evening, under a gray sky threatening rain, the vicar gave reluctant permission to exhume the body in Henry Charteris's grave, only for the purposes of proper identification. Craddock assured him it was a grim task. Miss Marple did not attend, though she waited nearby in the church porch, knitting slowly as the men worked. 2 hours later, Craddock returned, pale-faced and silent. Well? She asked. He nodded. Dog tags were there, but the dental records don't match. Neither do the scars. And the man buried in that grave was left-handed. Miss Marple looked up. Henry was right-handed. Craddock exhaled. We'll run the full tests, but we both know it's John Ellery. She folded her knitting. Then at last, the clock was right. He frowned. I beg your pardon? She smiled softly. It stopped at 7:17 to mark the moment Henry died in Bergen, 1943. Every tick after that, ... was a lie. Chapter 10. The man who never existed. There was a quiet unease in Marleycombe. Not just the aftermath of Edwin Fawcett's mysterious death, but something deeper, a creeping suspicion that the foundations of the village, the people long trusted, long assumed to be known, were not quite what they seemed. even the bakery, had gone silent about buns and gossip. Conversations now ended in lowered voices and unfinished sentences. Henry Charteris, or rather, the man known as Henry, had been central to their village for 20 years. And now, it seemed he had never existed at all. Inspector Craddock sat at his desk surrounded by files, wartime rosters, naval logs, witness reports. The postmortem on the body, exhumed from the Charteris grave, confirmed what he and Miss Marple already knew. Identity, not Henry Charteris. Likely identity, John Ellery. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, natural. No evidence of external trauma. It wasn't murder. But his life had led directly to Edwin Fawcett's death, which meant someone else, someone still alive, had killed Edwin to protect a very old lie. Craddock flipped through the last pages of Edwin's journal. There, beneath several clipped ministry memos, was a single name circled in red ink. Dinsmore. Captain Reginald Dinsmore had lived a different kind of post-war life, quiet but well-positioned. After leaving the Royal Navy's Intelligence Division, he worked in legal affairs for a shipping company, then for a private security firm. He had no listed address. His last known whereabouts were in Portsmouth, but 6 months ago, according to library records, he had signed the visitor's log in Marleycombe under the name Reggie Marks. Right before Edwin Fawcett's death. Miss Marple had suspected as much. He was the key, she told Craddock, the man who could confirm or bury the truth. Do you believe he killed Edwin? I believe he tried to erase Edwin. The man was a record keeper, a watcher, not a killer, but he had dangerous friends. Fawcett didn't die violently. No, but fear and pressure can kill just as surely as poison, especially when a man is about to expose a 20-year fraud tied to post-war intelligence. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Walter Eberhardt, the man who had once claimed to know the real Henry Charteris. "I've come to say goodbye," he said quietly. "Leaving Marleycombe already?" She asked, setting down her knitting. "I have answers now. You gave me that. So did Edwin. But the cost was high." Miss Marple studied him. "You saw the body in the grave." "I did, and it wasn't Henry. I knew the moment I looked." "Then you'll testify?" "I already have," he said, to Craddock. "He has my statement." And I gave him something else, a photograph, taken in 1943, the real Henry, with a small scar above his eye and a crooked incisor, neither of which the man in the grave had. She smiled softly. "That will help. For Penelope, most of all." Walter paused. "She doesn't deserve to carry the shame of a lie she never knew she was part of." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But now she can mourn the man she lost, truly lost, all those years ago." Walter nodded and turned toward the door. "And you, Miss Marple, will you rest now too?" She gave a faint smile. "Oh, I never rest when people are still lying." And someone is still lying. Because Miss Marple knew something Craddock didn't yet suspect. Edwin's death had not been an accident of stress or fear. He had been silenced, not by poison, not by violence, but by a subtle act that only someone with medical knowledge could perform. A dose, a whisper, a hand that seemed helpful, but wasn't. And there was someone in Marleycombe who fit that description. Someone who hadn't grieved enough. Someone who hadn't spoken enough. Someone who had watched quietly from the edges. She reached for her notebook and underlined a single name. Dr. Merton. Chapter 11. The doctor's Shadow Marleycombe's doctor had always been a trusted figure, respected. Soft-spoken, unfailingly polite. Dr. Albert Merton had delivered half the village's children, signed countless death certificates, and offered quiet condolences at every funeral. His hands were steady, his voice reassuring. And yet, Miss Marple now saw what had long been hidden in plain sight. No charges were filed. Not yet. But the clock had started again, not in the Charteris house, but in the hearts of those left behind. Chapter 13. The silence after the storm Marleycombe was quiet again, but not in the way it had been before. The stillness that settled over the village now was aware, like the hush that follows the last note of a funeral hymn. It was a silence not of peace, but of reckoning. The bakery had reopened, and gossip once more drifted from between racks of buns and jam tarts. But it had changed tone. No longer just curiosity or idle scandal, but something closer to awe and wariness, because for the first time the villagers realized they had been lied to for decades, and that lie had worn the face of a neighbor, Penelope. Charteris did not attend church that Sunday. Instead, she sat in her garden, beneath the lilac tree, reading and rereading Edwin Fawcett's final letter. She had tucked away every photo of Henry, removed the naval medals from their frame. She was building a new story from ashes, one that belonged to her alone. Miss Marple visited her in the early evening. "No one expects you to forgive him," she said gently, "but perhaps it's time to forgive yourself." Penelope nodded. "I'm trying. Some mornings I wake up and reach for him. Not the man I now know was false, but the one I thought I loved. I suppose grief is grief, even if it's misplaced." "Especially then," Miss Marple said. "You've lost someone who never truly existed, but who still shaped your life. That's a very particular kind of mourning." Penelope looked across the garden. "Do you think he ever loved me? Truly? I think he loved the safety of you, the gentleness. You gave him a world he could hide in. And perhaps, that was a kind of love." Penelope closed her eyes and nodded. "Then I'll bury the man I knew and leave the rest to history." At the police station, Craddock was finishing his report. Officially, there would be no prosecution. Dr. Merton had vanished into private retirement, and without a confession. The case was too fragile for court, but the truth had its own kind of justice. Craddock made sure Edwin's journal, notes, and final letters were archived under a sealed file titled Marleycombe Clock Case. Identity fraud, historical deception, suspected homicide. He knew no jury would ever hear the whole story, but he also knew Miss Marple had been right. Again, not she. Always was. That same evening, Miss Marple walked home beneath a pale spring moon, her footsteps light along the old cobblestone path. She paused by the churchyard gate and looked once more at the headstone bearing Henry Charteris's name. It remained untouched. No plans had been made to change it. But perhaps that was fitting. A reminder, not all lies are erased. Some become part of the landscape, worn smooth by time. As she passed the gate, a breeze stirred the ivy, and for a moment the broken clock in the Charteris house chimed, one long, echoing note. 7:17. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Some clocks stop to tell the truth. Some start again when the truth is known. Chapter 14. A tea leaf left unread was a Thursday morning when Miss Marple found herself once again at the Marleycombe tea rooms. The windows fogged faintly from the warmth inside, and the bell above the door jingled as she stepped in. "Your usual table, Miss Marple?" asked Ivy, the waitress, with a smile that barely masked curiosity. "Thank you, dear," she said, settling into the corner table by the window where she had sat every Thursday for nearly 30 years. Except now, the seat across from her was not empty, that it was filled by Margaret Greenleaf, the village librarian, a woman usually more comfortable around shelves than people, and who had never once invited herself to Miss Marple's tea. "Hope I'm not intruding," Margaret said nervously, adjusting her glasses. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Though I imagine you didn't come to discuss new mystery novels." Margaret looked down at the menu, but her voice was low and urgent. "I've remembered something. Something about Edwin. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Go on. Margaret glanced around, then leaned in. About a week before Edwin died, he came to the library just after closing. He seemed ... afraid, not of someone following him, but of what he was about to do. He left a note with me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A note? Yes. He asked me to give it to you, but only if anything happened to him. And then I forgot. Everything happened so fast. I tucked it inside the binding of an old gardening book behind the counter. I hadn't thought of it until today. Margaret fumbled in her bag and passed over a crumpled envelope. It had Miss Marple's name in Edwin's neat, precise hand. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Jane, if you're reading this, I may already be gone. There's something I never told even Alice, something I feared enough to bury, but I can't take it with me now. There was a second identity swap. Not just Henry and Ellery. Deansmore wasn't just helping Ellery. He was Ellery's handler. He knew everything. He approved it. It wasn't a mistake. It was a cover-up. To hide what Henry discovered. Henry found out about something called Nightingale, a name I don't fully understand, but he told someone in Marleycombe. I think that someone was Dr. Merton, and I think Merton did more than sign a certificate. I think he arranged Henry's death. Please, Jane, don't stop. At Ellery. Look deeper. Miss Marple. Read the letter twice, then lowered it gently onto the table. So it hadn't ended with a stolen name. It had begun because of one. Later that evening in her parlor, Miss Marple turned the envelope over. On the back, faint and nearly rubbed out, was a single penciled note. He drank chamomile. I never trusted it. She sat back in her chair. Breath held. It wasn't foxglove that killed Henry Charteris. It was something in his tea. A tea leaf unread. A clue dismissed. Murder had not just started with Edwin Fawcett. It had begun long ago. Chapter 15. Operation Nightingale. Miss Marple kept the house dark that night, save for a single reading lamp by her chair. Around her, the sounds of Marleycombe quieted, the hoot of an owl, a cart's wheels far off on gravel, the soft tick of her own small mantel clock. It ticked reliably, truthfully. Unlike the one that had started all this, she laid Edwin's final letter flat across her lap and read it once more, carefully tracing the name he had underlined. Nightingale. The word wasn't just poetic. It was a code name. Something covert. Something wartime. She knew where to begin. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock was flipping through military intelligence indexes at the county records office. Miss Marple sat nearby, sipping tea from a thermos she had packed herself. Craddock muttered as he scanned. Operation Nectar. Operation Nickel. Operation Nightingale. He read aloud. Operation Nightingale, 1942 to 43. High-level intelligence program. Objective: intercept and assess suspected traitors within British ranks during Allied operations in Northern Europe. Classified findings. Controlled by Internal Reconnaissance Group, IRG. Files restricted. Officer in command, Captain Reginald Deansmore. He looked up. Deansmore again. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Now we know why Ellery was chosen. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a placement. Craddock leaned back. Ellery didn't steal Henry's identity. He was assigned to it, as part of a posthumous intelligence swap. And Merton? She asked softly. Craddock rubbed his chin. The IRG would have needed a civilian doctor, someone to falsify records, keep post-mortem findings vague, and report to Deansmore if any questions arose. And Henry? Her voice lowered. He found out, didn't he? Craddock said nothing, because he didn't need to. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Penelope Charteris's cottage, holding the truth like a fragile bird in her hands. They sat in the drawing room, once again beside the silent grandfather clock. He had also signed the burial documents for Henry Charteris. He had certified Alice Conway's cause of death, and he had been the first on the scene when Edwin Fawcett collapsed. The pattern was not yet proof, but Miss Marple had never needed proof to begin asking the right questions. She arranged a visit under the pretext of an old woman's routine checkup, one of the privileges of age. At 89, few questioned Miss Marple when she expressed worry about her heart or digestion. Dr. Merton welcomed her into his surgery with a warm smile. "Good to see you, Miss Marple. What seems to be the trouble?" "Oh, just a fluttering. Now and then," she said. "My old ticker has its moods." He chuckled. "Well, let's have a listen." While he examined her, she studied the shelves behind his head. Neatly ordered files, a drawer marked war medicals, another labeled parish certificates. His movements were precise, habitual. "I imagine you've seen quite a lot over the years," she said casually. "Indeed, nearly 50 years in practice. I know every bone in this village, and every secret." He paused, just slightly, before smiling again. "Just the medical ones. And yet, some seem to bleed into the moral, don't they?" He stepped back, face unreadable. "That's a curious thing to say." She met his gaze evenly. "You certified Henry Charteris's body. Did you know him well?" "Well enough. I treated him for migraines. A naval man. Polite. Do you remember anything unusual about him? A scar above the eye? A crooked tooth?" He hesitated. "No, but I recall the limp." "How strange," she said lightly. The real Henry Charteris had neither. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "you're digging where the ground has long been settled." "I'm planting truth," she replied, equally softly. Was silence between them, a long one. Then he gave her a faint, mirthless smile. "You're clever, too clever for this village." "I'm just observant," she said. "And I observed that Edwin Fawcett died in your care. After visiting you the day before, he had high blood pressure. It wasn't a surprise, no, but it was convenient." Dr. Merton straightened. "Are you accusing me of murder?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, rising to her feet, "that you've spent your life making death look ordinary. And I believe Edwin knew what you did for Henry, or rather John. I believe you helped forge the identity, maybe even adjusted records. And when Edwin began to expose it, you did what you've always done." She fixed him with a steady look. "You managed the death." Dr. Merton did not respond. His eyes flickered once like a candle nearly blown out. Then, "You have no evidence." "I don't need it yet," she said. "But I have the truth, and that tends to be quite contagious." She walked toward the door. He didn't follow. Outside, the wind stirred the trees and scattered pale blossom petals over the cobblestone path. Miss Marple stood beneath the ivy-covered arch, her heart steady. Craddock would need time. The ministry would deny. The village would hesitate. But the shadow over Marleycombe was lifting. And soon, even the most careful doctor would find his hands no longer clean. Chapter 12. A poison too gentle Inspector Craddock sat in his office, staring at the pathologist's report. The handwriting was small and clipped, the tone clinical, but what it revealed struck him cold. Edwin Fawcett, cause of death: acute cardiac event, likely induced by hypotensive agent, untraceable post-mortem due to compound degradation. Symptoms: consistent with administration of digitalis or a derivative. No prescription records found. Conclusion: possible deliberate dosing. Craddock rubbed his eyes. Someone had killed Edwin, not with a weapon, but with a plant. A silent killer that mimicked nature, just like the man who administered it. You're certain? He asked Miss Marple that evening, standing in her parlor as dusk fell across the window panes. She nodded, knitting idle in her lap. Foxglove, digitalis. It can calm the heart, or stop it entirely. And it grows in the doctor's own garden. I've seen it myself. Not unusual for country doctors, of course, but paired with that postmortem? And he had motive. Yes, Edwin was about to destroy the entire illusion that he and Ellery built. Think of it, Inspector. Merton forged the death certificate in 1943, helped create the false Henry, perhaps for loyalty, or blackmail, or something darker. Craddock paste. It would have required wartime access, cooperation from someone in records, and likely payment. Miss Marple looked up. Then look at Dr. Merton's finances. See what happened just after the war. And again, shortly after Ellery's death. Craddock did just that. And what he found was startling. In 1946, Dr. Merton's account, previously modest, received a large deposit under the vague label of private compensation. Again, in 1965, following the death of Henry Charteris, there was another sudden windfall. Both untraceable. Edwin had uncovered these same details in his journal. The ledger entry, Merton 2 payments, hush honor. Craddock stared. At the word, hush a bribe, honor a reward. Perhaps both. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a final visit to the Charteris house. Penelope, pale but calm, led her into the sitting room where the grandfather clock still stood silent. I haven't wounded, Penelope said quietly. Good, Miss Marple replied. Let it rest. It's told its truth. Penelope offered tea, but Miss Marple declined. There's something else, Penelope said, holding out a sealed envelope. It arrived yesterday. No return address. But it's in Edwin's handwriting, postmarked 2 days before he died. Inside was a final letter. Penelope, I know what I'm asking is impossible, to question a life you've lived for 20 years, but I believe you are strong enough to hear the truth. The man you loved was not Henry, but that does not make your love false. It makes it tragic and real. He was a man shaped by war, a man who carried grief so heavy he chose to bury himself in someone else's life. I do not think he was evil, but I do think he did wrong, as did the man who helped him. Dr. Merton will never admit what he did, but he will fear the truth now that you hold it. You may choose silence, or you may choose light. Either way, I hope you forgive me for bringing you the storm. Edwin. Penelope. Read the letter again, as tears spilled silently down her cheek. He loved the truth more than safety. Miss Marple stood and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Some men do. By the end of the week, Dr. Merton resigned. He cited health reasons, quietly packed, left Marleycombe without farewell.